before we start, I would like to point out that if you want to use this official background, virtual background of today's event, you can download it from the dialog box posted by Changwan. Towards the end of the event, we would encourage everyone to put out this beautiful virtual background and take a group photo together to make this event more memorable. So let's get started. Good morning, everyone, and good evening for those who are in a different time zone. Welcome to the 6th event in our inaugural CNM book discussion series. So CNM stands for Communication and New Media, and we are based at the National University of Singapore, where we engage in digital media research from Asian perspective with global relevance. So this week we have already discussed 5 books examining various aspects of platform capitalism, big data, civil society activism, and data feminism, mostly with a focus on Asia, such as China, India, Singapore, and Japan. And today we are going to discuss Professor Lilly Irani's groundbreaking book, Chasing Innovation, published by Princeton University Press. The focus of today's book is slightly different than what we have been discussing so far. So Lily's book is about the most important aspects of today's globalizing economy, the entrepreneur who is no longer just a manager, but has become an agent of change and development. This is an award-winning book and has already won the 2020 ICA Outstanding Book Award, as well as Diana Frosty Prize from Society for the Anthropology of Work. So Lilly Irani is Associate Professor of Communication and Science Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Her research investigates the cultural politics of high-tech work practices with a focus on how actors produce innovation culture. She's an ethnographer of work trained to analyze interactional, organizational, and cultural dynamics as mediated by technology. And one of the interesting facts about Lilly is that she's also trained as a computer scientist and designer. And in her work, she draws on her training as computer scientist and designer to develop novel technical organizational system for contexts that she studies. Lilly specializes in the cultural politics of high-tech work in the context of South Asian development, as well as global AI economies. Lilly also collaboratively designs, builds, and maintains software such as Turcopticon. I will share the links shortly, that intervenes, resist, or demonstrate alternatives to existing platforms. And she also sits on the AI Now Academic Council. So Lilly will talk for about 30 minutes, followed by comments from our lead discussant, Dr. Angela Lee. So Dr. Angela is assistant professor at CNM. She's a critical scholar of information and communication technologies, especially interested in digital economies and the mutual shaping of technology and society. So after Lilly responds to Angela's comment, we will open it up for Q&A, and at the very end, we will take a group photo together, and hopefully all of us, or most of us, will be able to put the virtual background designed by our PhD student, Cheng Wan. So without further delay, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for being here in the morning in your in Singapore time. It's an honor to have been picked as a book to be part of the CNM Book Week, and I hope, and I'm really looking forward actually to hearing Dr. Lee's comments and to be in Q&A. To be honest, like that's my favorite part, because I spent a lot of time writing this book and I already kind of know what I think. So please get your own thoughts and questions and comments ready. So the talk that I prepared today is just a very short sample of some arguments that I make in my book, Chasing Innovation. Now, I realize that this is a digital media program, and this talk is focused on a lot of dimensions of entrepreneurialism that are not actually about digital media. Because one of my big concerns with my book was to understand how technocultures that have emerged around through the political economy of digital media come to be celebrated as models for how development should proceed, across, in this case, across India, and what are the hierarchies that emerge in that process of modeling development after the model of the tech entrepreneur? What kinds of inequalities does it re-entrench, and what forms of privilege does it mask or mystify? So the focus of the book, very broadly, is characterizing something that appeared to me over 5 years of fieldwork in India, that innovation was being posed as a solution to nation building with entrepreneurialism as its engine. And the book is specifically about India, but I actually chose to, make the ethnography in India a case of this kind of innovation with entrepreneurialism as its engine, because it's something that I saw happening in a lot of countries, including the United States, although the forms that it takes and the social relationships that get organized through it are going to, I think, look different depending on the histories of the countries where this scheme for development is playing out. So in the book, I focus on characterizing the practices and the emergent hierarchies of value among people, kinds of work, and also among modes of making change in the world, social change and economic transformation. I call this formation entrepreneurial citizenship, the system in which citizens are to absorb responsibilities for nation building by constructing markets, producing value, and directing projects towards more desirable futures. In the book, I point to how entrepreneurial citizenship displaces, ideologically and in practice, more democratic and social movement-based processes. Before the 20th century, to be an entrepreneur meant to be someone who managed an enterprise, undertaking projects financed by others and seeing them through. But how did it become a mythic figure assumed in many institutions to be a normative model of social life? And what types of social relationships does this model imply when some are entrepreneurs and others are consumers, beneficiaries of social enterprises and workers, essential but devalued in relation to the innovating entrepreneur? So with that introduction, I'm going to have a go again at my slides. All right, can you see the slides? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods, great, great. So I'm going to begin with the question of asking why did innovation and entrepreneurship become common sense among India's middle classes? And by common sense here, I draw on the work of political theorist Antonio Gramsci. He argues that ruling classes develop and teach common sense explanations of how the world works to those that have to be persuaded to consent to this regime of power. And the goal of common sense is to provide narratives that help those who are dominated make sense of the world in ways that make the interests of the ruling classes seem like the interests of all. So to answer this question of why innovation entrepreneurship became common sense in India, I'm going to turn to the worlds of policy and governance debates. First, to give you a picture of how entrepreneurialism driving innovation has been imagined in India, I want to contrast 3 different prescriptions for entrepreneurial citizenship from 3 elite policy actors. Their visions are varyingly capitalist, Nehruvian, and Gandhian, yet they share a belief in entrepreneurial innovators as a vehicle for national growth and distribution. And the distinctions between Nehru and Gandhi, I'll clarify those as I describe these 3 actors' points of view. So, so I'm going to highlight the commonalities among these, but also the differences among these 3 signal the varied historical strands of development that still animate Indian politics today. So first, on the upper left, Arvind Subramanian, a former International Monetary Fund economist, served as chief economic advisor to Prime Minister Narendra Modi from 2014 to 2018. Addressing a UPenn India Innovation Conference, Subramanian speculated about India's future, envisioning an India that exported information services like programming and tech support and trained skilled entrepreneurs and managers. Its wealthy invested their capital not only in India, but in other countries. For Subramanian, innovation emanated from gleaming office towers filled with the highly educated, accumulating profit that could register as economic growth and job creation and therefore development. He prescribed policies to empower these elites through easing restrictions on land, labor, trade, and foreign direct investment. Pitroda on the upper right, like Subramanian, is a non-resident Indian deeply involved in central government policy. He headed the National Knowledge Commission during the Congress Party's rule from 2005 through 2014. During a televised parliamentary panel on the Indian Institutes of Technology, Pitroda spoke about the poorest Indians at the quote, bottom of the pyramid, not as potential workers, but as village Indians in need of technical solutions, innovation, and uplift. The market alone, and finance capital in particular, simply, quote, extracts value through exchange, Pitroda argued. By contrast, engineers have the capacity to innovate by going to people, identifying their problems, and creating, and quote, creating value by solving them. Pitroda is himself an icon of this form. He had led the central government mission to bring telephone service to rural India in the 1980s, as written about by Paula Chakravarti. And this was not a vision of inventing for export, but rather of dedicating professional Indian inventiveness to domestic consumers and citizens' needs, a vision that included a role for the state. And finally, at the bottom of the slide, Indian Institute of Management professor Anil Gupta, by contrast, posited rural India, not engineers, not gleaming office towers, as the true, quote, hotbed of innovation. He did so through TED Talks, a trade book, and Indian policy seats. For decades, he held annual yatras, or walking pilgrimages, through rural India on a search for appropriate technologies and traditional knowledge ripe for capitalization. These rural innovators, he argued, made affordable, reparable, and clever technologies driven by their impatience to make life easier. Gupta and his team publicized and scaled up these inventions through patenting and licensing support, as well as a decades-old newsletter translated into a variety of regional languages. These are starkly different visions of who is an innovator, what innovation looks like, and by consequence, what policies and practices locate and support these special kinds of people. But all three agree on a basic vision of the inventions of the few, replicated by workers for the benefit of the masses, all while producing exchange value. I want to emphasize that the ways that entrepreneurship is a model of leadership of others, and the implications of this model then for how a democracy functions. This common sense elevates certain people as innovators and others as workers, consumers, or those otherwise affected. So who becomes an innovator and who becomes the innovator's others? Who conceptualizes and valorizes, and who does the work? Who modernizes whom, and towards what horizon? This hierarchy of futurity was built on several building blocks. First, the ideas of Joseph Schumpeter were often cited in these entrepreneurial policy circles. So for Joseph Schumpeter, the entrepreneur was not just a manager of themselves, as often written about in scholarship about neoliberal subjectivity, but the entrepreneur is actually a manager of others through organization, know-how, and resourcefulness. This other directed vision of Schumpeter saw the entrepreneur as a creative agent that generates novel sources of profit within an economy. The entrepreneur rearranged existing resources, relationships, and techniques to make novel forms of production, and crucially, he averted the falling rate of profit and the revolution that Marx predicted would come with it by finding new sources of value. The entrepreneurial citizen also made sense in India by drawing on older hierarchies of citizens in Indian society. So Nehru, India's first independent India's first prime minister, posited one India that plans, leads, and administers, and another that must be developed through education, work, health, and hygiene. Planners, scientists, and managers were meant to be separate from the squabbles of politics, systematically allocating resources and regulating production to express what Partha Chatterjee has called the unitary will and consciousness of a fragmented nation. This investment in a kind of expertise that can stand outside of politics was backed by investments in institutions like the Indian Institute of Technology, Indian Institutes of Management, and the National Institute of Design to produce these technical cadres. Gandhi had a different spin on elite leadership, articulating a trusteeship system in which the very wealthy were to keep their wealth, but spend it wisely for the benefit of a wider public, including their own workers. Both Nehru and Gandhi are models in different ways of what anthropologist Tanya Lee has called trustees, elites who claim the right to speak for the well-being of the population. The entrepreneur then is not just an anticipatory neoliberal individual, but also the manager and governor of their fellow systems for the projects they plan and are tasked with executing. The promise of the idea of an entrepreneur as an agent of Indian development, and then innovation as the mode by which this entrepreneur produces development came gradually over several decades. So I want to talk a little bit about the shifts in political economy that laid the groundwork for this seeming like a solution to the problem of development. So Delhi at the time of my fieldwork between 2009 and 2015 seemed a development boomtown. Since before independence, Delhi has been a center of development planning to modernize what Nehru has called a needy nation. The central government's pre-liberalization 5-year plans and import controls had given way after liberalization to facilitating public-private investments, partnerships, and the movement of capital investment. The central government turned to the entrepreneur as an agent of development through the process of liberalization, a process in which the state ceded power to industrialists, relaxed labor regulations, and ended many public monopolies. With liberalization, the once import substituting state began to cite private entrepreneurs as those who would have to step in and carry forward the work of the state, building roads, creating hospitals, and supplying commodities. India turned from an import substituting economy into one that had to, as anthropologist Laura Baer has argued, be repackaged for private investment. And those private investments then had to generate not only the cost of their operation, but actually a surplus that could then service the sovereign debt that India was taking on through its loans through the IMF and through investors in capital markets. This shift in how investment works came with shifts in citizenship policies as the state tried to find the entrepreneurs who could fuel this developmental strategy. The state created new categories of inclusion, person of Indian origin and non-resident Indian, to draw on diasporic, especially Silicon Valley expertise and wealth back to India. PIO and NRI gave rights of education, travel, investment, and property ownership to diasporic citizens of other countries. Notably, these rights were first extended to Indians in wealthier countries and only later extended to Indians in most countries. The state was interested in bringing capital and managerial expertise to India, even though workers of Indian descent all over the world actually send more money back to India in remittances. These citizenship regimes then prioritized the diaspora by those who had had the privileges of caste and class and being able to acquire education and acquire elite education and take that abroad to build wealth. Finally, within this shift to entrepreneurship, innovation came to signify intellectual property and the priorities of India's technology industries specifically. India had historically privileged access and wide manufacture of medicines and technologies over the production of new technologies or new medicines. So, India is one of the leading producers of generic drugs in the world, for example. Since the 1970s, India had enforced what are called process patents, but not product patents. So process patents say that if a product such as a drug exists somewhere, it's perfectly legal to find a different process to produce the same drug. The TRIPS agreement, the trade-related intellectual property agreement in 2004, however, forced India to accept product patents, forbidding the production of equivalent goods like drugs or like software, and thus making the production of novel products a legal and moral imperative. This is something that social movements rose up to fight in the access to knowledge movement. There are also domestic generics producers who tried to fight it. And so there are modifications to the TRIPS regime, but as I looked through planning documents and I looked through kind of news articles tracking innovation discourse, this 2004 was a key turning point where the law, where the laws changed and the discourse valorizing the innovator and making innovation into a policy priority in planning documents really came full force. So these policy shifts largely empowered technology and finance companies over the interests of domestic industrialists who prefer to protect the domestic market, or over the interests of others who might have an interest in freeing freeing software, making sure drugs are freely available, or other regimes of ownership. So here I want to talk about how the various kinds of images of innovation and entrepreneurship that did political work to smooth over these political conflicts at different points in these policy transitions. So early on, as India liberalized and wanted to open up its markets to companies in other countries, replacing import substitution, domestic industrialists actually screamed and shouted in ways that Lata Varadarajan has chronicled in her book, Domestic Abroad. And one of the moves that the government champions of liberalization made was to say that domestic industrialists need to come out of their stage of developmental infancy and be prepared to compete with companies all over the world. And they pointed to images of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs as a kind of rhetorical resource to argue in the public sphere that that Indians were prepared to do it. So the State Bank of India ad on the left has two men walking through a city that looks like New York City with a State Bank of India logo in the background. It says, "Proud to be Indian." These two men, can set up a thriving business in any foreign land. We provide backup. This is just one example of a kind of rhetoric that promised that India, subject to the volatilities and competition of global trade, could still come on top in select industries. So liberalization was happening in the 1990s. By 2000, up through 2000, like in the late 90s and through 2004, the Conservative Party, BJP, was in power. And there was an election that they were expected to win, but they actually got routed. Congress, more centrist party, won the majority of seats in the parliament on a program of called common minimum program, like rights to food, right to work, right to education. And at this moment in 2004, kind of national trade industry organizations, including NASSCOM, the tech industry organization, started flipping their discourse from this global Indians can be successful abroad to a discourse of inclusive growth. And inclusive growth meant not only can powerful elite Indians be successful abroad, but these powerful elite Indians should also create opportunities, the kind of development that the poor can feel at home. And so one kind of key text and key speaker at this time was C.K. Prahalad, a business school professor, who wrote the book Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, which advised companies on how to rethink their product and monetization models in order to make a market out of the poor. And finally, this document on the right, Creating a Vibrant Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in India, kind of represents for me the ways in which this program of entrepreneurial citizenship as a pathway to development was attempting to say that this is actually in everybody's interest. So on the cover of the report, you have the hands of a woman who's selling colored paint powders on the streets. This picture implies that the vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem includes women who are working in the informal economy, perhaps making just enough money to buy the product that they're going to sell the next day and perhaps to feed their families, perhaps taking microloans or living at the edge of debt. But this report was actually the report of the Committee on Angel Investment and Early Stage Venture Capital. And all the committee members were representatives from industry associations for technology and finance, as well as some government officials. So this report to me kind of is emblematic of the ways that entrepreneurial citizenship promises that everybody can participate and become an innovator, but it's actually organized around the interests of finance capital and the tech, primarily like the tech industry. Or at the time of the transition, those were the interests that were prioritized. So in the rest of the talk, I want to focus on how different kinds of creativity are produced, recognized, and valued in rural India as innovation or as entrepreneurship. And so I'm using creativity as a kind of catch-all term for the kinds of ways that we through our daily work, through our daily labor, creatively adjust and produce the things that we need to continue living. But only certain kinds of creativity can be recognized as innovation and entrepreneurship. So this case is drawn from a book chapter called Can the Subaltern Innovate? The story begins with me accompanying Dev Design, the studio I studied, to rural Andhra Pradesh. Dev Design was a firm ranging from 6 to 20 people in Delhi in the time that I studied it, and its founding members were born, raised, and educated in India. Of the founding and early members, many had worked at corporate jobs in banks, consumer product companies, and media, but they left to create the studio so they could pursue work that they felt, in their words, was more, quote, authentic and offered more, quote, creative scope. Though they also still constantly worried about how they added value in a volatile economy where they were competing to provide these design consulting services to a range of companies and nonprofits and foundations. And so I dive deep into kind of living as a designer and adjusting the studio's brand and the studio's understanding of itself to add value in chapter 4 of the book, but I won't go much deeper into that because of the short time in this talk. Only a few of the staff at the studio had trained as designers, but others had adopted design consulting methodologies as a way of making more locally relevant and self-expressive commodities. So the studio is an example of people who had very much responded to this bottom of the pyramid promise that you could make profits and ameliorate poverty at the same time. They did field work for London global health startups, redesigning hand sanitation. They coached Indian college students in design thinking to innovate water distribution. They refined and retooled corporate products to be to become corporate social responsibility initiatives and systems. They not only practiced design, but they evangelized it. And as English-speaking graduates of top Indian schools, most of who got to work at the studio in this kind of design and expert position were upper caste, readily, so through their networks, through the English speaking, through the educational credentials, they were readily recognizable to the people that would hire them and people they were trying to persuade in government as innovators who should be listened to. The Dev Design staff traveled to villages on a Global Health Foundation funded project to design affordable water filters. Their task was to study existing water practices, how people store water, drink it, taste it, and desire it. This applied ethnography work also included co-design exercises, engaging potential users and imagining future qualities of possible filters that they might desire. The designers met challenges during the fieldwork, though. As they went from village to village, many people complained of fluorosis in the region and asked for a fluoride water filter, not a bacterial water filter. Others they talked to said they wanted water to be sweet, a quality lost in filtration. Designers drew on a long history of fieldwork practices and interpretive tools intended to understand consumer desires so they could design things that triggered it. And their goal was to kind of overcome what resistance people might have by designing the water filter that people would recognize and want once it went to market. So as the designers tried to figure out how they were going to design a water filter that was bacterial filtration to a whole bunch of people who wanted a fluoride water filter, they found a hint while doing field work at a woman named Sushmita's house. At her house, they found a clay vessel and a plastic water bottle filled with water sitting by a pipe covered with a wet cloth. Sushmita, who lived in the house, had draped the soaked towel and suspended the vessel, effectively creating an evaporative refrigerator with items already available. As the water evaporates off of the cloth, it also draws heat away from the contents of the bottle. An American development consultant who was part of this design, who was a client of the design studio, saw this ethnographic kind of observation and excitedly explained, quote, "What they really want is cold water and consistent access." In the weeks that followed, the designers and the client NGO seized upon this creativity of Sushmita's as a sign of latent need, what professional designers called a workaround. Workarounds in the professional design discourses that I studied were taken to be temporary fixes to be addressed by a proper innovation process or a proper design process. In Hindi, Indian middle classes had other ways of describing such creative solutions. Jugaad. Jugaad connotes clever improvisation that achieves the goal in highly constrained situations. As the Indian press debated Indians' capacities to innovate, some marshaled jury-rigged devices such as wrapped vessels like these or bullock carts propelled by diesel irrigation pumps as evidence of a recognizably Indian form of innovation, and a form of innovation that signals that India has a capacity to innovate in this vibrant ecosystem of entrepreneurship that we've been talking about. Critics of Jugaad, however, countered that it stood for shoddy quality and short-term thinking that had hobbled India's development. In India's business line, a business publication, somebody who identified themselves as a strategy and innovation consultant wrote that Jugaad has no, I quote, design element or risk-taking. It is not born of research or from technical mastery, from identifying lacuna and customer needs or a eureka moment in the laboratory. Critics painted Jugaad as a form of situational reason, temporally and spatially particular, developed in the heat of the moment, and constrained by the rigors of necessity, or majburi is a Hindi word for this. In this frame, Jugaad mostly reproduced the status quo while finding niches of survival within it, producing use value out of waste perhaps, but not exchange value that could register as economic growth. By contrast to Sushmita's cooling vessels, this man's cooling vessels made him into a hero. The Mitti Cool, this refrigerator, this kind of clay refrigerator pictured here on the right, it works on the same principle as Sushmita's cooling vessel, but it is one of the rural innovations that Anil Gupta celebrates, a proper, reproduced, and scalable design. It creates not only use value, but exchange value for the nation. University of Iowa scholar Prashant Rajan has conducted life histories of Prajapati, the inventor of this refrigerator, and other rural innovators, almost all men, and his work illustrates the kind of support required to enable rural innovators to develop recognizably scalable inventions. And with scalable, even though I know this talk doesn't feature a lot about digital technology, we can recognize it in kind of technology cultures. Scalability is something that digital technologies are prized for in terms of initial investments that can then get scaled up to produce profit. And so I'm trying to show examples of how this kind of pressure to scale wends its way down to normative models of making a living for rural people as well. So Prajapati was only able to scale because he forged a relationship with a middle-class investor in a factory he worked in. Others that Prashant Rajan profiled in his case studies and life histories relied on salaries or day labor wages of other family members in order to have the time and resources to invest into making their inventions something that's branded and scalable. Others he featured found wealthier patrons. Some owned land. Anil Gupta, the professor I profiled earlier, and others actually argued that much rural innovation is developed through collective development among many people, through collective use, feedback, and refinement, rather than the proverbial individualized perspiration and inspiration. Yet the need to locate and lionize innovators, such as when Prajapati is named a national hero and given an award by the President of India on the left there, this need to lionize individual innovators reproduces the masculine entrepreneur who speaks for this distributed creativity and is the one to speak for it as they scale it up and command others' labor and resources. So part of what I want to make sure I emphasize here is that the labor of invention always requires the labor of keeping life going. And in some ways, entrepreneurial citizenship as a strategy for development asks people to do what has been called in new media studies spec labor, speculative labor that's unpaid with the hopes of a possible future return. And I also want to emphasize the ways that people who do this, who have the capacity to do this spec labor, have privileges in terms of the resources they can marshal and the time they can marshal to devote to these endeavors. So to conclude, I want to speak about the limits of entrepreneurialism. I spotted this Rolex ad in The Economist in 2013. It promises that, quote, anyone can change everything. The anyones are crucially people of color rather than the white saviors who've been critiqued in scholarship and politics of top-down development. Social enterprise promises a world without poles where people from the global south can be presented as grassroots, south-south achievement, and in a network, everyone seems equal. But in the few examples I've offered here from my book, I hope I've demonstrated what this image hides. In this image, nowhere are workers. The figure of these innovators who have won awards from Rolex for being change makers, the innovators here are connecting to the networks that they impact. But through the erasure of labor, we also have the devaluation of that necessary labor that has to produce any goods or sustain any change project that's supposed to have a durable impact on the world. And as I mentioned before, labor laws have been relaxed in India. Special economic zones actually are prevented from forming unions. And so this kind of devaluation of labor also has gone along with a weakening of labor's power to collectively participate in the terms in which they produce. Second, changing everything, as this ad promises, is a misleading fantasy of scale. Entrepreneurialism devalues solutions like Sushmita's water vessels that are created out of what she had in her household that might not scale up or produce a profit at a time, precisely at a time when the climate crisis is forcing many to ask whether the earth can continue to sustain expanding and resource intensive production processes. And third, change makers are not just people, but gathered up networks and resources that those people marshal. Entrepreneurialism is the kind of the leader, the person who can succeed building a business in any country. It masks the necessity of land, of others' income, and influential relationships necessary to start and sustain an endeavor, both asking people to shoulder risk as individuals and families, and also privileging a kind of creativity and problem solving that's most accessible to upper caste landed men and women. So in the book more widely, I also show how educational reform projects, hackathons, and the work life of the design studio all organize the hopes that entrepreneurial citizens bring to try to contribute to nation building and to improve their lives. They organize those hopes, those relationship networks, those creativity and those kinds of resources in their networks in forms that proliferate a range of experimental ventures. And the proliferation of experimental ventures, as Gina Neff has argued in venture labor, is most beneficial to capital investors, but not always the most useful or efficient way to expend social labor to make things that people actually need. For today, I hope I provoked you to think about how entrepreneurialism re-entrenches the very hierarchies that in ads and promises like these it purports to solve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Irani, for summarizing this very dense book in 30 minutes. I know it's always very challenging. There's so much goes into writing a book as compared to journal article. So I would now invite Dr. Angela to provide her comments.
Could you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for Professor Irani's presentation, which I think is really interesting and a lot of information, really informational. I don't know how to really start my comments, but or to say first is how I think about the book and also how this book relates to my own work. I think the book is really interesting from because it theoretically enrich and also empirically enrich the literature from the theoretical perspective. I think is really enrich the anthropology of innovation because it actually does not explore factors that lead to the creation of innovation companies, but instead have really attempted to understand the notion of innovation and that how this kind of notion of innovation is developed in India, which I think is really, really interesting. From the methodological perspective, I think it's also contribute a lot to media and also media studies and also studies of digital technologies, because Professor Irani follow a group of people which literally we have a dearth knowledge on them. For example, corporations, NGO, designers, and also technicians, because my own work focused on Didi Chuxing and the ride-hailing giant, and I wanted to conduct interviews with them. And I know we have a dearth of information on them, and also we know, at least I know, actually conducting interview and also conducting ethnography on this group of people is really difficult. So that actually related to one of my questions. I wonder whether or not you could talk a little bit about, the methodological and also ethical challenge when conducting interview and also when conducting ethnography with those group of people. Methodological challenging because we know it's somehow would say it's a closed subject, although it's not really closed as long as you build connection you can access, but somehow, for example, compared with, we know, I would say the service workers on the street is much difficult to access. And then, the ethical challenge, because we know we got some information and they still work in the corporation, and some might, the interviewee might concern whether or not the information we get would go against them. So there was some kind of ethical challenge here. And then I think Lilly's book is really, really relevant to especially the countries in Asia, I would say, because the language of innovation and entrepreneurship, and also the imaginations about innovation is so popular, not only in India, but also in China and also in Singapore here, and also I think also in South Korea. So it's somehow, I think it's really creates a lot of renaissance in the East Asia area. But my question here is, could you explain a little bit how this kind of notions and also imaginations about innovation in India or in other countries in Asia, as you have observed, different from the notion of innovation in the West? So, because I know, pursue for innovation, pursue for technological development, and also techno-developmentalism is actually not an idea that only in here, but probably around the world. So this is the other question. I also have the other question, but I don't know whether or not I could, phrase them in a really appropriate way. I don't want her to misunderstand what you're saying, but let me trying to present my idea. I think the idea of entrepreneurial citizenship is really inclusive, because it, as you have suggested, is considered as a tool or framed as a tool for nation building, but it sounds like it also framed as a tool for inclusive growth. So the term citizen here has somewhat a connotation of responsibility, individual rights, and also individual equality, and also some kind of the sense of a shared future. So this somehow is a list of value, described in the language or in the viewpoints of democratic value. As you have said in the book, right? So those kind of democratic value, and also those kind of language of shared develop is really well respond to the position of middle class, but not all members of the Indian society. So my question here is probably, how do you articulate the relationship between the capitalist mode of production and the domination and the idea of entrepreneurial development? In other words, do you think this kind of idea, the entrepreneurial citizenship change the idea of the capitalism, or how does this idea relate to, the workers who, who in the low paid, and also who in the growing numbers of highly exploitative and highly insecure jobs. And also how that relates to the talk, the last section of the talk, that the disappearance of labor or the cheap labor in India. And so how can they relate this phenomenon to, for example, the labor policy, rather than only, kind of the middle class language or the corporate government language. So because the last point that I wanted to mention is I think I share a lot of thought with you, especially you mentioned in the last session that entrepreneurial citizenship is somehow is really ideological mobilization, because it sounds to me like the corporate responsibility language. So for the corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility language is actually really not aimed at solving some problem, but by using this language, they wanted to deregulate, or they wanted to regulate themselves, because by committing themselves to somehow social responsibility, they show their they show the social dimension of the corporation, but somehow beneath, they actually pursue their own economic agenda, and also hope their economic agenda was not regulated by the governments. Yeah, those are my comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you for those really rich kind of comments and readings. I'll try to be kind of to and through them, because there are a lot of things, and please feel free to follow up or respond or remind me about something that I really didn't respond to properly. Yeah, what you were saying about corporate social responsibility, I absolutely agree with that. I think in some ways corporate social responsibility and inclusive growth have this kind of structural similarity to me, in that they assert either the corporation as the center and then include others in the kind of benefits of the corporation, rather than asking like what are the social needs and how can those social needs be fulfilled. So like at a very practical level, a lot of corporate social responsibility projects that I saw happening in my field work, where I had one sentence about this in the talk. It was, we build this, how can we make a version of this that seems to promise some kind of like social value for an NGO, so it was very much like, we sell hammers, how can we make everybody need a hammer? But inclusive growth as a discourse also, when I was trying to track where that came from, I found it coming up in the very early 2000s, and in the aftermath of kind of anti-globalization social movements, and the World Bank had developed this discourse of like, oh, people are not happy with the kind of structural adjustments that we have imposed, and so we need a model of inclusive growth, and we need to bring NGOs in who can kind of ameliorate some of the ills of these structural adjustments. And so in that sense, like corporations at the center of corporate social responsibility, the World Bank's kind of model of capitalism is the center into which people need to kind of be included. So you'd asked a question about what does this say about a kind of what does entrepreneurial citizenship say about a kind of capitalist mode of production? Maybe we should. I think that's maybe a better question for discussing back and forth. I'm not someone who usually makes big assertions about big shifts in modes of production. My training is in informatics and ethnography, and then I've kind of trained myself in political economy because it was incredibly useful to understand what people were doing and how their lives were changing. And also sometimes these modes of production arguments seem like they're very Eurocentric, and they kind of they just track Europe and the United States image of its own production. But I think what I found striking about this entrepreneurial citizenship model is the way that it it kind of renders precarity into a business opportunity and into something that can be celebrated. So Kalyan Sanyal, the political economist, writes about the kind of labeling of the informal economy in the 1970s in the United Nations as this part of the economy that is productive but doesn't fit into the models of like organized capital that political economists have. And he argues that a set of regimes of governmentality were developed in India to kind of manage the informal economy to maintain the legitimacy of the Indian state by providing like some basic services to people who are in this informal economy. But then, so within India, like this informal economy, I think with entrepreneurial citizenship, like gets reframed not as mouths to feed or to be managed by NGOs, but instead sources of economic potential. If like policies for skilling and training can train people how to turn the thing that they're doing into something more scalable, for example, or even so there are like kind of national human resources efforts, for example, to train kind of poorer workers in the kind of entrepreneurial branding skills. And I talk about some design institutes that train people in the entrepreneurially branding their scrap dealer business, for example. But yeah, I don't know if Angela, do you want to jump in on any of that before I go on and on? Because you asked so many questions that were great. No pressure.
No, I think it's just really offered good explanations. I think you can move on first.
Okay, sure. So you'd also asked about how imaginations of innovation in India might be different from the West. And I mean, in some ways, there's a kind of something that a lot of scholars of South Asia or like India specifically have written about when they talk about the project of like post-colonial modernity, that India or like post-colonial nations have to demonstrate that they have some kind of like national authenticity that needs expression, in culture and maybe policies that justifies why it is that they shouldn't be ruled by a colonizer, and they need to not mimic the colonizer's version of modernity. So in some ways, like entrepreneurial citizenship kind of allows for that, because it allows for all this kind of expression of national difference, but it actually allows for expressions of like regional and individual difference as well. It kind of like fits the liberalization of this project, where now like you're not just about being like a good citizen, like a government worker or somebody who, a factory worker, or a farmer, but actually you're an individual who buys things and has desires. And I write a little bit about that in the book, some education reform projects that were actually trying to get kids to see themselves as like much more individualized rather than linked to their communities. So I think, though it's not clear to me, though you can find examples of that kind of nationalism in the West too. Like Keith Murphy has an anthropology as an ethnography called Swedish Design, where he talks about the ways museums and curators and nation branding efforts need to kind of create a brand. But I think that the responsibility to do nation building and to do something that's recognizable as development is probably something that's different in the West. I think in the West, like entrepreneurship is imagined as producing like technological futures that are supposed to be ahead of everywhere else in a really like provincial and self-exceptional kind of way. But I think in India, like what I observed was a kind of, this kind of ambivalent discourse about both like the catch up and the leapfrog still implies that someone is ahead, that you have to be. And I write about this some in how the designers face this, that they feel like they have to be legible both to the West and also legible to their grandparents or to Indian investors, to Indian policymakers, depending on who, whether they're trying to satisfy getting investment or having family meaning. So I think that like in a post-colonial situation, there's this kind of double consciousness is Du Bois' term of knowing that you're going to be recognized in a Eurocentric way in this way, maybe the value of your work or your enterprise is going to be recognized in a certain way, but you also want to be recognized in a different regime of value that's about kind of nation building and post-colonial independence. I'm not sure that's a great explanation, but the other thing that I thought about is I think like in India, the kind of I described Nehru and Gandhi and their ideas of trusteeship, and Partha Chatterjee in Politics of the Government writes about the ways like kind of the Indian polity, like many of them are not trusted to be full citizens of democracy yet. Like they're in the waiting room, they need education, they need training to be able to actually fully participate as citizens. And then like those who are educated are kind of this like top tier, like technical cadres, middle classes. And so I think that developmentalist conception of hierarchy can justify the way entrepreneurial kind of leadership makes claims about like why they know what the future should look like in a particular domain, like whether it's new products or education reform or whatnot. I think in the US at least, kind of the sanctity of private property, including the private property of a business venture, and non-interference with what happens in the private domain, including like within like the factory, as you deregulate and like labor unions get weaker. I think like that becomes more of the justification that like there's a book called Private Government that traces some of these arguments and kind of like European and American jurisprudence that people are seen in certain kind of legal philosophies as the government of their private domain. So that's a little more speculative, because I don't write about that in the book. So I'm interested in others' thoughts too. And then you finally asked about methodological and ethical challenges, kind of because of the difficulty of accessing both like the field sites that I study, and also not wanting to cause harm to the people that I study. And so methodological, like the access part, I think the access to the field site came in part because I started off with a problem that kind of resonated with the people. I went looking for people who resonated with the problem that I was concerned with when I started this project in my second year of grad school, which is more about dynamics of globalization and who's recognized as innovative and who's not recognized as innovative for people in post-colonial situations who are participating in a global economy. And that interest came out of me working at Google in Silicon Valley in the mid 2000s, and just seeing how kind of like racialized ideologies, gave American designers, especially like white designers, like a lot of confidence that they knew what good design was, and the people in other countries who disagreed with them just didn't know what they were talking about. And yet Google, United States office was doing all the hiring. And so, I met a set of designers that were like, yeah, like we deal with this problem all the time. We have American clients, like they don't understand us. We're having to constantly learn to speak their languages. It's very frustrating. And what I didn't expect at the beginning of the project was to then kind of come to understand how those hierarchies that I was interested in a global context are also hierarchies that have different hierarchies with different histories, but that still, like animate this issue, animate like who gets recognized as creative or innovative within India as well. So like in one chapter, that Can the Subaltern Innovate chapter, I talk both about an Indian designer who's super well respected and very talented going to Europe and being told by a jury, like, nice work, but it doesn't really look Indian. And he's like very frustrated by this kind of failure of people in the West to recognize something that doesn't look to them like their stereotype of what India is supposed to look like. But then also the design studio, including this person who I really think is awesome and care a lot about, they were training, they were paid by the Indian government to train craftspeople from these ecotourism villages and how to kind of scale up and brand their crafts and to improve their quality for tourists. And the middle class designers had the same kind of dynamic and play with what they expected of villagers kind of creative design to look like, and they're like, oh, like this fluorescent thing that you've made is like not a high quality design. Like these other things speak more to like what your authentic kind of, what would be like an authentically expressive design. So that's kind of, so I kind of ended up finding out that it's turtled all the way down, as the expression goes. But I had a lot of stress about not wanting to, I didn't want to throw the people that had been so giving to me under the bus. As it goes. And so, I mean, one of the and that affected at the core how I framed my argument. So my argument is about kind of policy elites and like kind of is about how policy elites like produce this call to entrepreneurial citizenship. Like they call on citizens to participate in nation building in this way. They set up the legal policies. They narrate what development should look like in this way. And so then the ethnography becomes a story of how people respond to that call. Because in some ways I found that the people I was studying the design studio, like they didn't act, they were like almost like the nicer version of like what this entrepreneurial citizenship could be. Like, you know, you would meet people who are like, you know, have become very wealthy in tech and they want to go to a village and start a gigantic call center. Then maybe if labor gets too expensive there, they'll move the call center somewhere else. The designers that I was studying were kind of like, some of them still had investments in socialism and Nehruvian ideals, but there wasn't really a way to express those ideals. And they, at the time, were not involved in political movements. One of the people that I work with, who's still a friend, actually ended up getting really disillusioned and joining the Communist Party of India, and now is organizing actually with gig workers. So, you know, those over 10 years, you know, people change. But one of the things that she said when she read my book that she appreciated was like some of the histories that I trace and some of the policies, the histories of design education, the policies that I traced are things that she didn't really know about. Like she didn't really understand, like, oh, that's how I ended up being trained in this way. And that's not her being dumb and me being smart, because when I was working at Google, I was also hailed into these kinds of models of entrepreneurial citizenship, which is why I wrote about it. I also did not know the histories of policies. I did not know very much about how to participate in social movement struggles. I feel like entrepreneurial citizenship is a kind of distraction and a de-skilling from like more vigorous forms of kind of collective struggle that could might reshape the political economy or claim democracy in the workplace. And so I kind of wrote this book in the spirit of like being in solidarity with people like who like that were like I was before I started the book.
So,
if
yeah,
that answers
so
your
I
question.
think, yeah, you have responded quite well, and I am sure it will also open up a lot of other questions. So now I open the floor for Q&A. So anyone, if you want to type your question, or you can raise your hand, virtual raising of hand.
By the way, Lily, maybe you can unshare the screen. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I'll make it better.
You can see each other.
Changwen, why don't you ask your question? Yeah. Oh, wow. So many people are typing long.
A lot of questions. Like
I can see 3 questions here. So shall I read it, or
what would be the most efficient way? Yeah.
Shangwen, would you like to ask?
Okay. Hi, Professor. Yeah, my question is basically about the revision of your PhD thesis into a book. So, I mean, as a graduate student, I'm curious and I'd like to hear about your experience of making your PhD thesis into a book. And I noticed the keyword in your thesis is design thinking as an ethos of citizen, right? But in your book, the keyword has been changed to entrepreneurial citizenship. So how do you make this change, and why? And also, I noticed a change that is you have a historical part in your book. Well, it's not what's in your PhD thesis. Why and how you decided to add a historical part in your book? That's my
yeah, that's an amazing question. First of all, nobody's ever noticed that difference between my, well, first of all, the fact that you've looked at my thesis is amazing to me, and no one's ever noticed that difference before, and so I really am honored that you've spent that much time with my work. Yeah, so you're absolutely right about both points. I changed, so my PhD dissertation was written more as a critique of design thinking and design thinking practices. And so I felt like it had this problem that I was struggling a lot over, that I was just talking about, where, I was critiquing the practices of the design studio rather than critiquing the kind of political economy and ideologies that made this mode of development make sense to them. So it wasn't so much only about changing the keyword from design thinking to entrepreneurship. It was also about I came to understand design thinking. The design thinking practices of this design studio, I came to understand as just one case of how a social group attempts to make their collective aspirations economically productive. And in this case, they do it by adopting these design thinking strategies, because design thinking to them represents a kind of profitability, but with a sense of care and participation by people who you're trying to build stuff for, which, some companies who build, surveillance and policing technologies don't care about that much at all, right? So, and I also hope that then in that reframing, like, I kind of show that this studio is a kind of, that they are trying to kind of enact some values that I agree with, but they're enacting it in a way that kind of leaves them constantly facing contradictions as the promised formats of projects to achieve social uplift, like, always run into like the funders' restrictions, or needs to be made financially viable. And so they have to kind of cut it or shift it, or they have to rely on infrastructures that are already cheap, and because no one wants to invest in the infrastructure that's needed for the real solution, like the fluoride water filter. So that's why, so it allowed me to also kind of address that kind of ethical issue. Does that answer the first part of the question about the shift of design thinking to entrepreneurial citizenship? Okay. Yeah, and then I also hope that with entrepreneurial citizenship, it would be, sociologists have this concept, this idea of the middle range concept, where I'm not trying to say this thing exists everywhere and trying to universalize, but by the middle range concept is something that where you kind of illustrate the social processes that that produce that concept, and then other people who read and know that concept can go and ask, does this concept seem to illuminate something in the situation I'm looking at, or the situation I'm looking at? Like, so entrepreneurial citizenship seemed like a more useful, like, diagnostic concept, because I saw this entrepreneurship push happening in many places, and more than maybe, it had more explanatory power, I think, policy wise, than design thinking. And then in terms of the historical chapter, so the honest answer for any PhD students or people who are trying to think about converting their dissertation into a book is that I wrote a book proposal that was closer to my dissertation. I think it had the entrepreneurial citizenship reframing, and I gave it to a mentor, Fred Turner, and he kind of gave me comments on it, and he was like, well, one question I have is, like, you talk about the cultural politics of how this is working, how this plays out in everyday life, but I don't understand what the capital P politics are. Like why is this thing happening? And so I spent another year reading in political economy and history, and trying and reading lots, I read a lot, thousands of pages of planning documents over 50 years, and tried to trace how these words change. I did news searches to try to trace when particular ideas come to be dominant, and how those are tied to historical events. And so that's what, the question was what prompted me to write it. But then my editor actually suggested that I cut that chapter. Sorry, editor, for outing you, because he thought I should get straight to the ethnography, and I said no. So I did defend the chapter, because I think that chapter for me was actually the stuff that was in my dissertation was me explaining to other people the weird logics by which kind of design and idealism and labor work, because I've studied it, but I'd also experienced it. I think that history chapter and the political economy chapter is where I came to understand, not only why their lives were being structured that way, but more how to understand how my life was being structured that way. But some of you who are more political economy oriented programs might not have to learn that lesson kind of through such happenstance. So much respect to you.
So we have 3 more questions. So Wei Yu, would you like to ask?
Well, sorry, I'm not showing my face. I'm not really very presentable now. Lilly, thank you so much for your presentation, this book, as well as the question answering just now. I think you have probably answered my question already, right? So you said that the purpose of reflection might not be criticizing what the people in the field side are doing. Rather, we're trying to see why they have been persuaded by the national discourse of entrepreneurship, right? As something that they should spend time pursuing, right? So I really appreciate that answer. Maybe I can reframe. Sorry, since I got the chance to speak out, maybe I should rephrase my question to another one, which is quite relevant actually to Ziyi's question. I really appreciate that how you link your work to all the development ideology and development discourses, right? You see in India. That's something I used to work on as well. How so-called the post-colonial modernity is imagined in different countries, right? So my question is, entrepreneurship or the emphasis on innovation or creativity is not just the thing in India, right? It's seen in other developing, so-called developing countries like China as well, right? But the interpretation or judgment regarding this discourse is quite different, right? For instance, in China, is seen as sometimes a way for an authoritarian state to control the minds or control the so-called potentially disruptive actions from the grassroots, right? So basically, people will spend time and energy on innovating, not on rioting on the streets, right? So I would like to hear your so-called interpretation or judgment about this new entrepreneurship discourse, maybe in different contexts, right? You talked about your interpretation in India. How do you see the Indian experience be, I don't know, shared or not really shared in other contexts?
Well, it's interesting. What you said about entrepreneurial citizenship as a way of engaging people and innovating and not going out to protest, that actually is something that comes up in Indian planning discourses also. There's a planning document from maybe like 2013 or something like that kind of presents these futuristic scenarios. It's a planning commission document. It's like, here are 3 scenarios for India's future. And then like one of the scenarios is, there's like a policy logjam, nothing's getting passed in parliament. Young people that are part of the demographic dividend who should be made productive are actually in the, are in the streets and causing social unrest. And so, entrepreneurship is one of the ways that this logjam the political logjam can be broken by just having entrepreneurs kind of produce these myriad projects that can engage young people, create jobs, and generate social order. And also, I think in the conclusion, I talk about something a reviewer actually pointed out to me, which is that the U.S. Department of State was promoting entrepreneurship education in Muslim majority countries as a matter of soft power policy. And they talk about it as a way of converting minds that might be kind of frustrated with their situation, away from terrorism and towards the kind of becoming partners in a global economy. So, to be honest, like in the book, I pay a lot of attention to like the specific histories of India and what was informing the kinds of sense making and infrastructures and institutions that were shaping these practices. But today I find myself more interested in the things that are in common across these sites, because I think by finding similarities across the sites, social movements can find political lessons that they can perhaps adopt in their own contexts, even if the contexts are different. Yeah, like I think, and in that sense, like the whole concept of entrepreneurial citizenship is kind of an invitation for people to look for similarities while also kind of noticing any differences that might be relevant to how they want to advocate for a different kind of developmental or political economic regime, if that makes sense. I'm not sure. Those are the thoughts that I have in kind of response to your question. I think I'm coming from like a place where, like someone was talking to me the other day about the global South. Is a global South like a useful category, or does it cover over actually certain kinds of like transnational projects of political organization and extraction that we actually need to pay attention to, and maybe like breaking things up into kind of national comparisons is missing the actual like emerging political economic configurations that we need to attend to. So I feel like China is like Belt and Road Initiative, and like the ways that like India has actually been influenced by China's policies in terms of like the citizenship regimes I described. Like I think India took those ideas from China, the PIO and the NRI. There's a flow of strategies, and there's a flow of kind of infrastructure and capital that I think my book does not focus on, but I think maybe I would say others should, because I wrote my book over 10 years ago. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is very interesting. So I think we have one more question from Satyaki.
Hi. I have pretty poor lighting, so I have switched off the video. So thank you for the great presentation, by the way. I had a question which, so please correct me if I'm wrong. The example of Mythical versus the community innovation, that really summarizes your book, if I'm not wrong. So my question is that they are twofold. One is the system does not recognize any of these innovation, unfortunately. That is, neither the Mythical nor the community innovation is recognized in the patent system. And therefore, I have two questions. One is, how should the system first recognize these innovations? And the second is, how should the value reach the community rather than the intermediary?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that the answer for that is maybe, my hope was that by writing this book that I would kind of pose the question that, my hope was that someone like you would pose this question, that we could kind of answer it collectively in a bunch of different ways. But and one thing I will say is like the way I did kind of, I think I simplified a little bit in explaining that the patent system does not recognize either the default patent systems that TRIPS imposes does not recognize the community's kind of product. But one of the things that the Honeybee Network, Anil Gupta's project, has actually done is to create a different patent license that says that companies that of a certain size have to pay royalties to use a patented rural innovation, but people who are not, but entities that are not companies, like individuals or communities, can use a rural innovation for free. And so it's kind of this like dual patent that's kind of open source for peasants and working people, and gets money out of those who are going to go and generate lots of profit from it. So that's one attempt to bring some both recognition and space of rights to the community. I think one of the things that I'm really, I think one of the things that I think needs, oh shoot, like, do I want to say this? Yeah, I think something like, basic universal resources like healthcare and education and universal basic income provide, if we want to enable communities to kind of have space to create and innovate, I think providing structures that provide the basic and essential resources that people need to live and to have time to do this is the way to do it. Right now, entrepreneurship just says, you know, you go figure it out by getting your community to kind of crowdfund it in American or kind of tech parlance. And that's actually extracting money from the bottom and from communities to create speculative experiments that maybe if an investor invests in it, then it can generate some profits that the government can tax, or that can, yeah, it can then go to service sovereign debt. Like right now, the way it's set up, it's like sucking resources out of communities. And I think that resources should be distributed back into communities so communities can have more to create the things that they need with. That's a really oversimplified answer, but yeah, this is, you know, kind of policy is, I can't get really like a lot more specific than that right now, but I'm really interested in other ideas people might have.
So I think we have time for one final question. ZE, would you like to?
Hi, Lily. Thank you for the great presentation. And my question is, the open source solutions and the sharing of the skills in joint working places and other types of communities has significantly weakened the requirements of capital. And those technologies enabled people are underprivileged, are able them to become entrepreneurs, become their own boss. Sometimes they're become their own boss and gain full autonomy is their ultimate dream. So from my understanding, the entrepreneurship is not only top-down ideology, but also a needs from the bottom up. So when we critique the neoliberal entrepreneurialism, sometimes there is another side of the story is from the bottom up. They want to become their own boss. So how do you deal with this kind of this kind of a binary thing, or maybe it's not binary?
And yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one thing I hear in your question and comment is, you know, how do you deal with the aspirations people have to work in a different formation than, say, a corporation? And so that's something I heard a lot about from the middle class people that I was doing field work with. You know, that they would talk about, you know, these big companies that they'd worked for, and they were really frustrated and not being given tasks they didn't think were very meaningful. And so this was a chance to, and I write a lot about that in chapter 4. And in chapter 4, you know, I also talk about how, you know, there's this great value placed on creative freedom. They don't talk about it as being their own boss. They talk about it as like freedom, authenticity, having the wider scope of engagement, convincing the client, but and they even use the studio for their own creative ventures and activities like DJing and making art and film. But there's a subtle way that like certain kinds of skills that they can share with each other, like aesthetic production, programming, like certain skills are kind of more valuable in the contemporary political economy. And they actually provide, like they enhance the skills of the studio to provide valuable services. Other skills are not are not nearly as valuable. So for example, something like what would be like a skill that was like not, I feel like a skill that was like not really that valued would not, you know, like something like weaving or cooking. There are things that people in the studio like to do, but they would only become like weaving never really became something they could like sell to a client. You know, it was something they could say like, look, I'm a cool artist, like, don't you believe I can innovate better, hire me. You know, cooking, like people tried, one group actually started a restaurant where and they tried to put their cooking skills into, you know, to monetize it, but like starting a restaurant is a wholly different thing than like cooking for your friends and like providing care that way. But you know, programming was like an incredibly valuable skill. Now in the context, so like in that chapter, I kind of talk about the really subtle ways people kind of get brought closer into the studio, or like kind of get asked to leave the studio based on how valuable they seem to the studio. And And then the other thing about that studio is that like not all, when you're trying to be your own boss, you're always going to need someone to do stuff that you don't want to do. Cleaning the toilets, like doing the accounting, like running errands. And so not everyone you're not going to have an economy where everyone's their own boss, because when there's always something that you're going to have to pay someone for that they maybe don't want to do either. In the case of, I would question whether, something like open source software allows, disadvantaged people to really become entrepreneurs in their own right. Like a lot of the scholarship on digital kind of labor suggests that, it's people who already have a lot of resources that are able to like get their apps to become really popular or put in the time to developing apps. One of the things that I do write about in the book in the hackathon chapter was that these open source infrastructures are built specifically to serve the needs of a kind of political economy centered around like European and Western like internet production. So like you can find a lot of like WordPress plugins and tools and like e-commerce retail stuff, but there's not a lot of open source like stable libraries for what the people at the hackathon wanted to build, which was kind of like digital software that could interface with radio networks to give people like voice communication abilities in rural areas where they might not have internet. For that, you actually need someone to invest in like building the infrastructure. But the idea that you could just take open source infrastructure, again, is relying on resources that are taken to be out there in the world and available for free for reuse. And so like that I think that's like one core thing that my book is trying to point out about entrepreneurship, is that it tries to make value out of whatever it finds in the world for free without paying any attention to how to restore or sustain it. I guess like that would be my one sentence. And people might disagree with me. And I welcome you to provide me counter examples or write about the counter examples, because the point of this is to figure it out together.
Excellent. I think this is a very good way to end. But now before we end, I think we would like to invite everyone for the photo session. I think Changwen has already shared the virtual background, and I know like some of you may have the old version of the computer which does not allow. So even then it is fine. You can join us for the photo session.
Okay, I will do several. So please keep smiling. Okay, one. Okay, the second one. Okay, the last one. Wait a minute.
I love your emojis. They're cracking me
Okay,
up.
well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's getting late. Yeah, in New York,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think we also have to, I would also like to announce for the final talk today evening. So we are going to discuss Prototype Nation by Sylvia Lindner. So please do join. It's around 8 p.m. Singapore time.
That's amazing.
Yes.
I just saw Sylvia this morning, in fact.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. So we are going to chase. We are going to chase innovation from India to China now.
All right. Well, thank
Thanks
you
so
so
much,
much for being
Lilly.
here
Yeah.
and for the great, thoughtful questions. Please email me at my email is easily findable, but oops, I DM'd
Definitely.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Keep in touch, everybody.
And also, if in the future you're going to India again, please try stop over Singapore.
Okay. So I bet Singapore Airlines can take care of that,
Yes.
for me, probably.